Cruel parents kicked me out at 14 for being too weak to work. But years later, I'm living in my uncle's house that I inherited, but now they're begging to get back in my life. I feel like the most unfortunate 14-year-old in the world. I am in the countryside of Arkansas, where everyone is mostly a farmer. Children are made to start early on the farm, and only a few parents who grasp the importance of education bother to send their children to school. I am not lucky to have such parents. My father does not have land of his own, but he always buys the produce of different farmers and sells them in the market. I have a younger brother of 10 years called Toby. I was a high school junior when I turned 14, and though I did not fully understand how important education was, I knew I wanted to be something more than a farmer, but my father ruined my hopes to pieces 2 days after my 14th birthday. My father called me into his room and told me that the time had come for me to quit my education. He said that arrangements had been made with a friend who owned a large expanse of farmland, and I was going to be one of the hired laborers there. I was 14 and skinny. I didn't have the kind of physical endurance that my peers had, and I didn't know if I would say it was because my brother and I weren't properly fed by our parents. I felt bad about the arrangement, but I was in no position to air my opinion or challenge that of my parents, and that was how I kissed my education goodbye. I passed out on the farm on my first day of work due to exhaustion. I couldn't fully describe the kind of commotion that happened. After I was revived, the farm owner himself took me back home to meet my parents. He told my parents what had happened, but my parents were more concerned about me resuming my work as soon as possible. My father told his friend not to worry, as I would resume work the next day after I must have taken that day to rest. I was pained by my father's comment, but his friend's response was comforting. His friend told my parents that he was no longer willing to let me work on his farm as he did not think that I was fit. My father tried to convince him, but he said he did not want to get into any kind of trouble. He left the house, and my parents were angry at me for the couple of days that followed. My younger brother watched in terror because he knew that it was the same fate that awaited him in 4 years, if not less. My father tried to get other employers to take me in, but the news about how I had collapsed on the farm had traveled around the community, so it was difficult for him to convince someone to hire me. My presence at the house began to irritate my parents. I never seemed to do anything right in their eyes. They shortened the ration of meals that I ate and still complained that I ate too much. If something was out of place, no other person was held responsible. With the way they came at me, it was surprising that they did not complain I was sucking up too much oxygen in the atmosphere. After my father had failed in getting me another work, I thought it would be a nice idea to go back to school instead of staying at home doing nothing, and so I approached my parents one evening to make the suggestion, but that was a very bad idea. I got into my parents' room that day and their faces twisted to indicate their disgust at my presence. I told them that I needed to speak with them about something very important, and my father asked me to hurry up with whatever I wanted to say. I began to tell them how I felt that going to school was a better way to spend my time, as I could not just sit idly at home. My mother got up from the bed and walked past me like she was going to use the bathroom while I continued to talk. I immediately heard a loud bang and I saw stars. My mother had given me a slap from behind and I staggered a bit as she threatened to deal with me if I did not shut up. She said I was too weak to work and contribute to the family, but when it came to my school, my strength was over the roof. She turned to my father and said her suspicion all along was very correct. My mom had told my dad that I had made up the fainting drama just to make sure that I was never sent back to the farm to work. My father then gave me an ultimatum to go out each day till I found someone willing to hire me for labor, otherwise, he would kick me out of the house if there was no result after 1 week. Unfortunately, there was no result even after 1 week, and my father fulfilled his promise of throwing me out. They initially ignored me after I told them that I could not get a job, but I never knew that they were already plotting my exit. I was surprised when I saw child protection services in our home. My parents had noted that they could no longer care for me, so I wanted them to move me to a foster home or an orphanage. The Child Protection Services, CPS, were at our home to ascertain if what my parents claimed was true or if it was just a case of irresponsible parents trying to evade their responsibilities. I listened as my parents spoke about business being very bad and finding it difficult to feed my younger brother and me. They said that, at that point, they could only care for one of us. After the agents from CPS listened to them, they noted that before sending me to a foster home or an orphanage, they would need to check if there was any living relative of my parents who would be willing to take me in, and only after then would they settle with the other options of orphanage or foster home. My father immediately said that the only living relative he had was his cousin Uncle Jeff, who lived in the city, and they had not seen him in a long time, so he was not sure he was capable of taking me in. My father claimed that Uncle Jeff was struggling, as at the last time he had heard about him, not heard from him, and do you know how long it had been? 7 years. Yes, you heard me correctly. My father has not been in touch with the only living relative he has for over 7 years, and he was using the information he had from several years ago to conclude what he felt would be the outcome if the CPS approached him and asked if he could take me in. The truth of the matter is that there is a great possibility that Uncle Jeff might be financially able to take me in, but I am not sure he would be willing, and this is something my parents know very well. Uncle Jeff used to live with us years back. He had gone through college against the advice of my father, who, up till now, still sees academics as a waste of time and resources. I can vividly remember various times when my father would almost fall out with him because he felt Uncle Jeff was just using education as an excuse to be lazy and not join his mates on the farm. Well, Uncle Jeff graduated from college and would have even gone for his master's degree, but there was no money, so he decided to get a job. There was none. He did his best but was just unfortunate, and my father began to get irritated. It got to a point where my dad could no longer bottle down his anger, so he called Uncle Jeff one day and asked him to leave his house because he could not keep on feeding him. Uncle Jeff tried explaining to my father that he was doing his best to secure a job, but my father pinned his decision on him. My father blamed him for wasting his time and little resources on school. Uncle Jeff was forced to leave the house that day, but rather than remain in the countryside, he permanently relocated to the city. Now, here is my question: if you were Uncle Jeff and you made money, would you be willing to take in the son of your cousin who threw you out of his house and never called you all these years to check up on you? The CPS has promised that they would reach out to my uncle and see what his response would be. I feel uneasy because I believe my uncle would not want to take me in, and I could land up in a foster home. I guess I would find out my fate in a few days. Update 1: It has been years now since I promised that I was going to keep you guys updated, and I apologize for that. A lot has just been going through my life. I am 19 now. The CPS got back to my parents to let them know that my uncle had decided to take me in. My parents were as surprised as I was because they felt Uncle Jeff would reward their act of wickedness with unkindness. They were rather happy that I was going to be taken off of their hands. As we waited for the appointed day when I would be taken away from home to go and live with my uncle, my parents repeatedly told me that since I had decided to tread the path of Uncle Jeff, I would end up like him and never do well. The words of my parents had a strong negative impact on me till I went to Uncle Jeff's place. I remember the day when I was taken away by CPS. The only person who was emotional about my departure was my little brother Toby. He ran after me as I was being led away, and he held on tightly to me and began crying while saying that he did not want me to go. I cannot describe the kind of pain that I felt. I immediately joined my brother to cry. My parents wasted no time in coming to separate us. They did not shout at my brother for trying to stall my departure, as the CPS would get a hint of the kind of parents they were. They told Toby and me that my departure was for the best, but one thing I was certain of was that Toby was going to have an encounter with my father's belt that day. I was nervous as we drove to my uncle's place. We got there and my uncle seemed very happy to see me after so many years. I was not moved by a show of care and excitement because I felt all of that was make-believe to have the CPS believe that he had my best interest at heart. After about 5 minutes of discussing with my uncle, the Child Protection Services left me with him and I braced up for the worst, but it never came. Uncle Jeff exclaimed that I was all skin and bones, and after he showed me to my room, he quickly began to fix me something to eat. The quality of the meal which was set before me was something I had never eaten in all my life. If that were what my parents called a failure in life, then I would love to turn out to be a failure. I cleared out my plates within 5 minutes, and without asking if I was satisfied, my uncle dished out some more. I was allowed to take a long nap that afternoon before my uncle, and I had a lengthy discussion. My uncle shook his head in disappointment as I explained to him what had truly happened. He said that if it were up to my parents, they would throw me out without getting the CPS involved, but it would be seen as abandonment, and they could be arrested, and that was why they had involved CPS. Uncle Jeff immediately put me back to school. He did not have a child of his own, and a series of heartbreaks had taken his mind off marriage. He said he would consider getting a surrogate in the future, but he was focused on building his wealth at the time. 2 years went by and my parents had not checked up on me to know how I was doing. I did not expect them to, but their wickedness had gotten to my uncle and he decided to confront them. Uncle Jeff took me with him that day. His car had broken down, so we took a taxi. We got to my parents' home and everyone, my parents and Toby, was around. Toby was the one who opened the door to usher us into the parlor where my parents were seated. The moment I saw Toby, I realized how really good and gracious Uncle Jeff had been to me. I had grown from skin and bones to someone who was well fed, but that was not the same for my brother. Toby was excited to see me, but he did not express it for fear of my parents. He just stood at the door and smiled at us till my father asked who it was that had come to visit. Toby said nothing. He just stepped aside for me and my uncle to go in. My mother was the first person to speak, and both the tone and words that came out of her mouth were filled with sarcasm and mockery. She asked if my uncle was already tired, and by that, she meant tired of me. That question cut me like a knife. It was more like I was some baggage to anyone who came around me. Thankfully though, Uncle Jeff wasted no time in blasting them. He told my parents that he had brought me so they could see how much better I was doing after they abandoned me. This, according to my uncle, was proof of their failure as parents. My father said the only thing they could see was that I was sucking up all of Uncle Jeff's resources, and that was the only reason why I was healthy, and they asked him to take me and leave the house if he had nothing else that was important to say. Uncle Jeff called them shameless and signaled me so we could take our leave. We were going, but my heart was bleeding and my legs were heavy. While all this drama was going on, my brother Toby did not say a word to me, and I knew it was because our parents had already painted me and cautioned that he kept his distance. I am currently 19 and in college, but I am seriously worried about my younger brother Toby because I know that he cannot get the best in life while staying with my parents. Update 2: It has been 3 weeks since Uncle Jeff and I visited my parents, but I visited them again just yesterday. I was not myself after my uncle and I came back from my parents' home, and this was something Uncle Jeff could easily detect. I quickly opened up to him the moment he asked what the issue was. I told my uncle that my parents were the cause of my moodiness. Toby had aspirations that he could not achieve while living with my parents because they would require that he go to school, and my parents were not fans of that. Secondly, the relationship between my only brother and me now seemed distant, and this was not what I wanted. Uncle Jeff said my brother's situation was miserable but nothing could be done as he lived with our parents. If the problem was that Toby lived with our parents, I reasoned that the solution would simply be to get him out, and I felt all we needed to do was just to ask my parents. Since they had willingly given me up, then they would jump at the thought of having someone else take responsibility for Toby also. Uncle Jeff knew where I was heading, and before I could make the suggestion, he told me that the reason he had said it was pitiable was not because he could not or was not willing to take in my brother, but because my parents would not be willing to give him up. I still insisted we tried, and he noted that I could, but he was done relating with my parents. I visited my parents yesterday, and as expected, they were not glad to see me. My mother was not around this time, but my dad was, so it was just me, him, and my brother. I began to tell my father that I had come because I wanted to have Toby move to the city where we stayed so he could go to school and all. My father kept quiet for about 2 minutes after I was done before asking if I felt he did not have the interest of his son Toby at heart. The answer to that question was very obvious, but I did not want to start any form of drama, so I replied by saying that I was only considering what Toby wanted for himself. My father immediately snapped. He said what he wanted for Toby was more important than what Toby wanted for himself. Now, that is what I call entitlement. He did not even care that Toby was standing right there. Toby is 15, and just as he had done with me, my father had already taken him out of school and started pushing him towards a path he did not want to follow. I don't know where the boldness came from, but I am grateful it came. I told my father that forcing Toby to a path he did not choose for himself would only make him harbor hatred towards them in the future, but my father said the contrary would be the case because Toby would be grateful he had listened to him. Toby, at that point, was audibly sobbing, and my father asked me to leave. He warned me to never show up at his house again. I stood up and left. Uncle Jeff was right, after all. I am not going to give up and let my parents successfully ruin the life of my brother with their entitlement. Toby is 15, which means that in 3 years, he will have reached the legal age where he can make decisions for himself and no longer be answerable to my parents. I just hope that when the time comes, he will still have the desire for school and not have given in to the disillusioned philosophy of our parents. Update 3: Op is 21 years old here. I am now what most people would call a big boy when they judge from a financial standpoint, but my heart is currently heavy even as I type this. I know you might be wondering how I did it, especially since it has just been 2 years since made my previous post. Well, 2 years is enough time for situations to turn around for an individual, is it not? I am just kidding, though. The fact that I am now worth a little over $500,000 is no effort of mine. My uncle and I lived quietly after I had concluded that I did not have parents, but I began to notice something with Uncle Jeff. His health was declining. I was concerned about it, so I asked him, but he said there was nothing to worry about. I found happiness in his words of encouragement till one time when he called me and initiated a discussion about how to always find strength in life even when one feels alone. It seemed awkward, but I tried not to read much meaning into it. Uncle Jeff asked what I would do if I had all the wealth that he had amassed to myself, and I began to talk about how I would open up a scholarship fund for children in my countryside who, like me, desired to go to school but did not have parents wealthy enough to send them there. I was still talking when my uncle began to cough. I sympathized with him, but I immediately ran to get him a glass of water the moment I saw that the cough was persistent. I was back with a glass of water in no time, and as he stretched out his hand to take it, I discovered it was covered in blood. This was way more serious than I thought. After the situation seemed under control, I encouraged my uncle that we went to the hospital right away, but he was rather calm about the whole thing. That was when he told me that he had stage 4 lung cancer. According to him, he had been undergoing some treatment before then, but the thing only grew worse. I felt really bad, but the greater blow came when he told me that the doctors had given him a few months to live. I did not know what to do. I could give whatever was demanded of me then just to save my uncle's life. I could not bear the thought of him dying, so I began to suggest that he tried other well-known medical centers around the world, but he told me that he had been to quite a number of them and they all had the same diagnosis. I lived in torment every single day from then on because each day was a reminder that I had limited time to spend with someone who meant the world to me. As the days rolled by, my uncle had to be admitted to the hospital, where he began to put his things in order. I informed Uncle Jeff about my desire to call my parents and let them know of the development, but he asked me not to do it. He said they had turned their backs on him all of his life and so he did not need them as his life was drawing to a close. Uncle Jeff then informed me that I was going to be the sole owner of all that he owned. I thought it was just the beautiful house that he had built and a modest amount of money in his account, but I was mistaken. Uncle Jeff said he was well worth over $500,000 and it would all be mine. It did not matter, though. I was too heartbroken to care. I disobeyed what you would call my uncle's dying wish by reaching out to my parents. I just had to. I know how rocky things are between us, but I was willing to overlook the hurt that my parents had caused me over the years so that my father could make up for his only living relationship, who was about to die. My father's line was not going through, so I called my mother. The moment she heard my voice, she hissed and passed the phone to my father. My father responded with a yes. And it meant that I had a few seconds to state my reason for calling. I then told my father that Uncle Jeff was seriously ill and admitted to the hospital. I was still talking and about to get to the part where Uncle Jeff had only a few weeks to live, but my father blew hot over the phone. He said that after my uncle and I had disrespected him, I was now calling him to ask money for treatment. That was not even the painful part. The painful part was when my father now said that even if Uncle Jeff and I were both dying, a dime of his hard-earned money would not come our way. This man was heartless. I would not have been so pissed off if I had just listened to Uncle Jeff and not reached out to my parents. I had taken the route of peace as I called my parents, but their show of selfishness was too much to stomach, so I just cut the call. Uncle Jeff passed away this week, and though we had talked a lot about me being strong when he died, something which was inevitable, it just turns out that you cannot be too prepared for such an event. Update 4: I had disobeyed my uncle's dying wish of not informing my parents about his ailment, so I decided not to let my parents know that he was dead. After all, my father had pointed out that he cared less if either me or my uncle was dead. I had never organized a party in my life, let alone a funeral, so I did not have an idea where to start. Thankfully though, things just seemed to flow without stress, and the moment I informed his close friends about his death, they took it upon themselves to make sure my uncle was given a befitting burial. The funeral day arrived, and it was a pity I had no family member around to give me the kind of emotional support that I needed. Uncle Jeff had not just been an uncle to me, he was the father that my father refused to be, the mother that my mother refused to be, and more. Uncle Jeff was not a religious person, so the ceremony did not take place in a church but in a funeral home where his last wish of being cremated would take place afterward. It was time to pay our last respects, and I was the first. Watching Uncle Jeff lying in the coffin like he was having a peaceful sleep seemed like a bad dream that I would pay for anything just to wake up from. It took the strength that I did not have for me not to break down and cry like a child. I found a corner where I stood by myself, just letting my thoughts wander. I was immediately jolted back to reality when I heard someone saying, "He was a good soul." The voice sounded very familiar, like that of my father. I turned back to see that my parents were there standing with some of my late uncle's friends, and they were probably painting themselves like they were close to him to know him very well. The sorrow that I felt immediately turned to anger, and I began walking towards my parents. I did not know what I was going to do, but I knew I did not want them there. They were not supposed to be there. I approached them, and my mother asked why I never informed them that Uncle Jeff was dead. I responded by saying it was because my late uncle would not want them present at his funeral and suggested it was best to leave. My mother said I had no right to make such demands, and I realized I was about to create a scene when my attention was needed. It was time to have my uncle cremated. I temporarily ignored my parents and was about to go and attend to other matters when my mother said that my pride would be deflated now that my uncle had died without leaving anything for me. I did not reply to her statement of mockery. My uncle was cremated within minutes, and I thanked everyone for coming. I appealed to the sympathizers to come to the house for some light refreshments. My parents were one of those who showed up. I was with some guests who were expressing their condolence when my parents walked in through the door. They were surprised because they never expected that my late uncle could build such a house. My parents walked up to me and asked if it was truly the house my uncle had built. I stood up from the sofa where Elle sat with some guests, looked at my parents, and gave an unexpected reply. I told them that my uncle had indeed built the house, but it was now mine. My mother asked if I truly meant what I had said. I said yes, and even noted that Uncle Jeff had left me $500,000 in my account. Their jaws dropped, but while they were still looking for the words to say, asked them to get their asses out of my house. Everyone was surprised. My father said they were still my parent and I could not disrespect them that way, but I called the security to push them out. I emphasized the pushing part, and I am sure Uncle Jeff would be smiling if he could see. My parents were shamefully thrown out of the house and apologized to the guests for the little chaos. I assured them that it was what my uncle would have wanted. I would be changing my name soon enough. Toby is currently 17, which means by next year, I will attempt to convince him to come to live with me so my parents can spend the rest of their lives alone. Thank you all for supporting me throughout and listening to me.
Beneath the moon's soft glow, where the waves kiss the shore, there's a lullaby of the deep in the ocean's gentle roar. Oh, the sea's cradle song tales of ancient mysteries, and every ripple's flight in the embrace of the tide, where the stars paint the sky. There's a melody divine in the seabed's soft cry, or the sea soothing hymn, carried by the breeze that echoes of the timeless peace in every rolling sea. Hear the harmony of waves as they dance upon the sand. In the symphony of nature, hear them tell. Oh, the sea's gentle chant guides the weary soul, a beacon in the darkness, making broken spirits whole. So let us sail on dreams to where the horizon meets. In the embrace of the ocean sun, find solace.